They called me meticulous once, the kind of investigator who could reconstruct the truth from the smallest fragment, who could walk into a room of silence and hear the echoes of what had happened hours before, who could take a single drop of blood, a strand of hair, the angle of a footprint and build from it the whole story of a crime. My life was built on evidence, on proof, on the faith that justice could never be denied if the truth was carved into the record. But faith is brittle, and the night my family was slaughtered I learned that truth is nothing when power rewrites the evidence. I came home to a house painted in blood, my husband sprawled across the kitchen tiles, my little girl clutched in his arms as if even in death he had tried to shield her. I remember the smell, metallic and raw, the silence that should have been broken by laughter but instead carried only the hum of the refrigerator. I remember the mark on the wall, a message scrawled in red that read, "The system protects its own." And when I pieced together the fragments, the fibers, the prints, I knew exactly who had done it. Not a stranger, not a random killer, but a man whose face I had seen across courtrooms, a man I had testified against, a man who should have rotted behind bars. Yet when I carried the case forward, when I stood before the court trembling but certain, the evidence disappeared. Chain of custody shattered, witnesses silenced, files erased. And the man who murdered my family walked out free, smiling as he looked at me, smiling as if to say that my truth was powerless against their system. That night I burned. Not just in grief but in revelation. The city I had served was not governed by law but by a council of shadows, powerful men and women who bent the rules, who erased crimes, who traded lives for favors. I had been a servant of evidence, but they were the masters of its disappearance. And so I became the final piece of evidence in my own case, the one they thought they erased. Because days later my house burned, my body never found, my name etched onto obituaries. Isolde Crane was declared dead, and in their arrogance they believed I was gone. But I was not gone. I was becoming. I disappeared into the veins of the city, into its forgotten tunnels, its abandoned stations, its derelict warehouses. I stripped away the identity of the investigator and forged something new. I studied not only crime but fear, not only evidence but performance. I crafted masks, I crafted silence, I crafted the symbols that would become my calling card. Because if the system thrived on erasing truth, I would resurrect it in the most terrifying form. The first time I marked one of them, it was not with blood but with memory. The prosecutor who had buried evidence in my case thought himself untouchable, living in glass towers, sipping wine while children like mine were lowered into graves. I broke into his home one night, not to kill him, but to teach him that silence had eyes. When he woke, he found his dining table transformed into a crime scene reconstruction of my family's murder. Photographs pinned to walls, fibers placed on plates, footprints marked across his expensive rugs. And at the center, a single feather dipped in ash, my symbol. He screamed, called police, called guards, but they found nothing. It was gone by the time they arrived, except for the terror carved into his bones. Weeks later, he vanished, suicide, they called it. I never touched him, I never had to. Fear was the scalpel, guilt was the poison. From there I moved like a phantom. Every target tied to the man who had killed my family, every shield that had protected him, every corrupt hand that had signed his release. I marked them each in turn. A judge woke to find his chambers staged like a morgue, tags tied to his robes, his own name etched as cause of death. A detective who had destroyed evidence found his car filled with files he thought he had burned, each one labeled in red ink perjury. They fell not by my hand alone but by the weight of their own crimes crushing them when I dragged their sins back into their lives. Yet all of it was only prelude, only the first whispers. Because the man himself, the killer, the one who had stood over the corpses of my family and laughed in silence, he still walked free. He hid behind the council that had saved him, behind their money, their influence, their silence. But I was patient. Forensic work had taught me patience, the slow piecing together of fragments into clarity. And in the silence of my exile, I gathered every fragment of his life. I knew the passwords he used, the mistresses he paid, the alleys he walked when he thought no one followed. I knew the taste of his lies, the rhythm of his breath. And I knew that when the time came, his ending would not be swift. It would be surgical. But as I hunted, I began to feel something else. A shadow in the silence, a presence moving parallel to me. Sometimes when I left a mark, another mark appeared nearby, not mine, not his, but different. A white feather where mine were black, a note written in script I did not know, a whisper that another ghost walked these streets. At first I thought it was my grief playing tricks, then I thought it was the council itself taunting me, but soon I realized it was something deeper. Someone else was watching, someone else was playing a game with my game. Still, I pressed forward. Because vengeance is not a choice, it is gravity. It pulls you until nothing else exists. The night I returned to the courthouse, the one where justice had been denied me, I left my boldest mark yet. I broke into the very room where the killer had been declared free, and I transformed it. Mannequins posed as the jury, their eyes covered, mouths stitched, the judge's bench smeared with red handprints. And at the center of the floor, a chalk outline of a little girl holding her father's hand. My little girl. Their silence screamed when the morning came, when photographs leaked, when the city buzzed with rumors of a phantom avenger. That was the night they named me. The widow. A myth whispered in corridors, a shadow mothers warned their children about, a figure both feared and sought after. They thought giving me a name made me less dangerous, but they were wrong. The name became the weapon, the echo that carried my silence into every dark corner of their world. And as I stood above the courthouse that morning, hidden in the skeletal frame of a half-finished building, I watched them swarm, judges, officers, politicians. I saw fear written across faces that once smiled at my ruin. And I knew this was only the beginning. The killer would come. The council would reveal itself. The shadow that watched me would step into light. But I was ready. Because Isolde Crane was dead. The widow lived. And the silence that birthed me would bury them all. They thought the myth would fade, that whispers of the widow would dissolve like smoke, but myths are not born to vanish, they are born to haunt. I became the unseen rhythm of their nights, the shiver that crawled over their skin when the lights dimmed, the echo of footsteps when no one followed. And with each mark I left, the city shifted, fear spreading not like wildfire but like a slow rot, creeping through every corridor of power. The council began to fracture, their meetings hushed, their alliances strained, each one wondering who would be next. And that was my weapon. Fear makes them sloppy, fear makes them tear themselves apart. The first of the inner circle to fall was Counselor Harrington, a man whose hands were soaked in the erasure of dozens of cases, who had dined with killers, who had traded freedom for bribes. He had thought himself untouchable, guarded by walls of money and men with guns. But when he returned to his mansion one night, he found every room transformed into a mirror of his victims. Photographs printed large and plastered on his ceilings, evidence files he thought destroyed pinned like trophies. And in his study, his own desk was reconstructed into a morgue slab, a toe tag tied to his name. He stumbled out into the night, called his guards, but none answered, their radios filled only with static. When police arrived, they found him hanging in his library, the word justice carved into the wall in ash. I had not touched the rope, I had not needed to. Fear did the rest. But Harrington's death rippled through the council, forcing them into retreat. They hired private security, locked themselves behind gates, surrounded themselves with cameras. And yet, still, my marks appeared. A judge found his bed filled with shredded files, each page spelling out his corruption. A police chief discovered his patrol car daubed with chalk outlines of children, each tagged with case numbers he had buried. A senator's family photographs were replaced overnight with morgue shots of the innocents his votes had condemned. They screamed at one another, demanded to know how I moved unseen, demanded to know which of them was betraying the others. And in their paranoia, they began to devour themselves. But for all my strikes, the man himself, the killer who had taken my family, remained beyond my grasp. I stalked him, traced his movements, learned his rituals. He had become emboldened by the fear around him, strutting through corridors as if protected by the council's failing power. But he too began to feel my silence. He awoke one morning to find his walls etched with blood-red handprints, none real, all painted but perfect enough to shatter his composure. He found recordings of his own laughter spliced into news broadcasts he watched. He discovered feathers in his coat pockets, left while he slept. I was the ghost in his life, and though I had not yet cut his flesh, I knew I was cutting his mind. Still, as I dismantled them piece by piece, the shadow I had felt before grew closer. I would leave my black feather, my symbol, only to find a white feather placed beside it, mocking me, mirroring me, answering me. Sometimes a symbol of infinity scrawled on walls near mine, sometimes a note folded into evidence bags with words like "We are watching you." And I began to wonder. Was I truly alone in this war, or had I become the pawn of something larger? I dug deeper. Archives, whispers, hidden files. And in the rot of history, I found fragments. Cases where killers vanished, where corrupt officials walked free, and always, whispers of a ghost that stalked them too. A figure not unlike me, silent, precise, leaving symbols that were not mine. Was I their echo, or were they mine? Had I been allowed to become the widow, or had I been sculpted into her by hands unseen? One night, I found the answer scrawled in fire. The courthouse burned, not by my hand but by another's, and on the ashes, painted in soot, the words "Only one truth may survive." And there it was, the confirmation. I was not the only shadow in the city, I was being measured, weighed, perhaps prepared. Still, my focus remained. The council was weakening, their fortress crumbling. I struck harder. I infiltrated their data vaults, exposing transactions, leaking recordings, turning the public's gaze upon them. Riots sparked, protests grew, the city trembled. And yet, the deeper I cut, the more resistance I felt from unseen hands, files erased even as I uncovered them, names blurred from records I had stolen. It was as if someone else was editing reality alongside me, as if my evidence warred against an invisible archivist. The climax came with Counselor Vane, the architect of the killer's release, the one who had signed the final dismissal of evidence. She was the spine of their corruption, the queen in their chessboard, and I knew that if she fell, the rest would shatter. I staged her downfall meticulously. Weeks of surveillance, infiltration, planting doubts in her allies, whispering truths to her enemies. And when she walked into her own office one morning, she found her walls covered with enlarged case files, each one nailed with surgical precision, her face cut from photographs and replaced with corpses she had condemned. Her screams echoed through marble halls, her security fled, and when the public stormed her chambers days later, they found her curled in the corner, rocking, muttering about feathers and ghosts. She had not died, but she was gone, her mind hollowed, her empire broken. With her fall, the council imploded. Alliances shattered, power fractured, silence broken. The killer, my true prey, no longer walked with arrogance but with guards, always looking over his shoulder, his swagger dissolving into fear. I knew his turn was coming. But as I stood above the city that night, watching fires burn in protest, hearing chants of justice rise where once silence ruled, I felt no victory. Because for every mark I made, another mark appeared beside it. The white feather, the infinity sign, the whisper that I was not alone. And deep down, I began to fear not for myself but for the truth. Because maybe this was not my war alone, maybe I was but a test subject in a greater experiment, a shadow war older than my grief. Still, vengeance drove me. And so I sharpened my silence, prepared my final descent. Because the killer who had laughed over my family's corpses still breathed, and until he was erased, my war was not done. But in the back of my mind, I knew. The moment I struck him, the other shadow would reveal itself. The moment my vengeance ended, a larger truth would begin. And in that anticipation, in that silence before the storm, I stood ready. Isolde Crane was no longer dead, the widow was no longer myth. I was the executioner, the ghost, the last evidence. And the city was my crime scene. The city had begun to tremble beneath my silence, cracks spreading through the council's marble foundations, whispers turning into shouts, shadows colliding with light. Yet for me, it all narrowed to a single face, the man who had stood in my home with my family's blood on his hands, the man who had laughed as justice was buried. I had carved fear into the bones of those who protected him, I had dismantled the fortress that shielded him, and now he was exposed, trembling behind guards and locked doors, his arrogance dissolved into paranoia. But vengeance is not a blunt instrument, it is a scalpel, and I would not strike until every detail was aligned. Because this was not just a death, this was an autopsy of his soul. I followed him through his routines, each one shrinking as his confidence withered. He no longer dined in public, he no longer smiled for cameras, he no longer spoke to allies. Instead he lingered in shadows, hunted by the ghost he had created. One night, as he moved through an alley, he found crime scene tape strung across the exit. And at his feet, chalk outlines of two bodies, one small hand within another. His scream carried into the night, but no one answered. Because the city itself had turned against him, its silence now my weapon. I infiltrated his sanctuary, the high-rise penthouse where he thought himself safe. I replaced his mirrors with photographs of his victims, I filled his showers with crimson dye, I stitched into his pillows the words "you are already dead." Each act calculated, each strike psychological. And though his guards doubled, though his walls grew thicker, still he could not sleep, could not breathe without feeling me near. The night of reckoning came not with thunder but with quiet. I entered his fortress not through violence but through absence, disabling power, cloaking myself in darkness, slipping past his protectors like a shadow already inside their lungs. He stumbled through candlelight, clutching a gun, muttering my name, though he did not know it, only the myth. And when he opened the final door, he found his living room reconstructed into my crime scene. Photographs, fibers, chalk, every fragment of my family's murder displayed in perfect forensic order. And at the center, two mannequins, one tall, one small, their faces painted white, their eyes hollow. He fell to his knees, screaming, firing into emptiness, and that was when I stepped from the silence. I did not speak. I never spoke. Silence was my verdict. He begged, pleaded, offered me money, secrets, allies, but his words drowned in the vacuum I carried. I raised my hand, and in it, not a weapon but a feather blackened by ash. I placed it on his chest, over his frantic heartbeat. And he understood. His body collapsed, not from my blade but from the collapse of his own terror, his heart breaking under the weight of guilt and fear. He died clutching the feather, his eyes wide, his silence eternal. But vengeance is never the end. Because the moment his corpse grew cold, the shadow I had felt all along stepped into the light. When I left his fortress, I found symbols painted on the walls, not mine but theirs, the infinity sign, the white feathers scattered across marble floors. And a message etched in soot across the city skyline, "Welcome to the circle." I followed the trail, deeper than the council, deeper than politics, into the roots of something older. An order not of law or crime but of balance, an unseen tribunal that had shaped history through silence. They called themselves the archivists, a network of watchers who recorded every atrocity, who sculpted myths to maintain equilibrium, who chose executioners and ghosts like pieces on a board. And as I traced them, I realized the truth that cut deeper than any blade. I had not risen alone, I had been allowed to rise. My grief had been observed, my vengeance permitted, my silence amplified. I had been their instrument all along, their new widow, their weapon forged by tragedy. I confronted them in their cathedral of shadows, a chamber lined with evidence of centuries, relics of killers and avengers long before me. White feathers on pedestals, photographs of nameless faces, files etched with symbols instead of names. And at the center, a figure cloaked in gray, voice calm, telling me that I was never alone, that I had inherited a role, that vengeance was not mine but theirs. But I was not their pawn. I was not their soldier. I was silence, and silence belongs to no one. So I tore through their sanctum, scattering their relics, burning their archives, erasing their evidence. They screamed not in pain but in loss, for truth was their only weapon, and I stripped it from them. Yet as the flames rose, the gray figure only laughed, whispering that destruction too was part of the record, that even my rebellion had been foreseen. I walked into the night, smoke trailing behind me, the city in uproar, the council dead, the killer erased, the archivists wounded but not gone. And I understood the weight of the war. Vengeance had ended, but the conspiracy endured. Now I move not only for my family but for every silence stolen, every truth buried, every ghost erased. I am not their widow, not their pawn. I am Isolde Crane, born of evidence, reborn of fire, sculpted in grief but sharpened by defiance. I am the silence that will not be archived, the crime scene they cannot contain, the verdict they cannot rewrite. And as I vanish into the city once more, leaving feathers in my wake, I know the shadow war has only begun. Because somewhere beyond me, the archivists wait, patient, eternal, sculpting their truths. And I will hunt them, I will tear them from the roots, until no archive remains, until silence belongs not to them but to me. The widow lives. And the world will learn that no one erases the evidence forever.